Good evening, this is woodblock printmaker Dave Bull, back again with the next video in our series documenting the production of our new edition of the Great Wave image. You have just seen a few minutes of video taken during my ongoing work on the carving of the key block to this print, which is now very near completion. In the previous video, which I made a couple of weekends ago, I discussed some research points, looking at differences between two prints in major museum collections. I had intended this episode to be a continuation of that discussion, but something has come up that caused me to change my plans a little bit, and we'll put off that research discussion for a future episode. I have some very interesting news to relate to you, but in order for me to explain it properly, I'm going to have to take a small detour. Bear with me here. We're going someplace interesting, I think, but it's going to take a couple of minutes to get there, and we're going to have to start by looking at a few of these old ukiyo-e prints. Pretty much everybody knows that word ukiyo-e. It's the convenient word used to describe the genre of images, mostly woodblock prints, created during those years that Japan isolated itself from the rest of the world. Themes included actors on the kabuki stage, courtesans from the Yoshiwara, travel images of famous places. It was an astonishingly productive genre. It covered around 200 years if you look at it roughly, and involved at any given time dozens of publishers and many hundreds of skilled craftsmen. A very important characteristic of the field that many people today don't understand is that the prints were, without exception, produced by teams. The actual artist, the Toyokuni or Hiroshige, whose name is associated with this now, never actually touched the pieces of paper. The publisher would initiate a project, hire that designer, Hiroshige for example, to create the basic sketches for the series, and then he would hire outside workshops for the actual production. Carvers to carve, of course, printers to print, and then the publisher would put the prints for sale up in his own shop. It's only the designer's name who we remember now, but each and every one of these prints was actually built by many hands. As Japan opened up in the Meiji period and commercial printing technologies flooded in, along with the massive social and cultural changes taking place, the ukiyo-e pretty much came to the end of the line. Moving into the 20th century, almost nothing remained of it but the making of reproductions for the tourist market. Many of the carving and printing workshops disappeared, their workers either retiring or just dispersing. But the concept of collaborative printmaking didn't die, and there was another strong kick at the cat in the first half of the 20th century. This was the genre we know as shinhanga, which literally means new prints. These prints built on the underlying technology of the old ukiyo-e. The same wood blocks and paper, the same production techniques, the same grouping of workers, publisher, designer, carver, and printer. But they brought a much more westernized and much more sophisticated type of image, involving modern perspectives and a vastly more complex layering of tones and colors. You might be familiar with some of the more well-known designers, Hasui, Yoshida, Tsuchida Koitsu, but you are almost certainly unfamiliar with the carvers and printers. Maeda, Ono, Yokoi, Harada. The shinhanga prints were staggeringly complex to produce, and their existence was only possible because Japan in those early years of the 20th century was still a third world country with very low wages in comparison with most industrialized countries. Paying the workers in, at that time, very cheap yen, but selling the products to foreigners overseas for very expensive dollars was what made it all possible. There was a window of opportunity open for just a few decades, and those very enterprising and creative publishers, Watanabe, Yoshida again, Doi Hangaten, they had a field day of it. The Second World War put an end to the party, and although the genre attempted a comeback once peace arrived, the economics had changed. The workforce was dispersed, and it was pretty much game over. During that span of a few decades or so, a few hundred beautiful woodblock prints came into being. The genre never had the massive impact on world art culture that the ukiyo-e had had some generations earlier, but it still remains a wonderful body of work, and early prints of this type are eagerly sought after by collectors around the world. This example belongs to my friend Mr. Toshikazu Doi. It's by the designer Tsuchiya Koitsu, carved in part by Mr. Harada Kametaro, and was printed in the Yokoi workshop. Okay, enough lecture. Let's change the topic completely, and bear with me on this for a minute because we are actually going somewhere. Let me talk about myself for a minute. Here's a photo taken back in 1989 when I was just a little kid. In those years, I lived with my family, wife and two little kids in a small apartment in a suburb of Tokyo, and there was certainly no space for a dedicated workroom. I did my carving work, as you can see in that photo, on a board positioned on top of a low kotatsu table. I told myself that this was temporary, and so it was. Just about a year or so after I began making prints for sale, I got a chance to join an event called the Japan Expo over in Los Angeles, being invited, along with a number of other Japanese traditional craftsmen, to do demonstrations and sell our work. I accepted the offer, but was faced with a bit of a problem. What to do about a workbench? I couldn't take that little table, obviously. Now, a traditional printer's bench is very simple. It's just a little slab of wood you basically place on the floor. But I do both. I do carving and printing, and I needed benches for both. And they had to be portable. So I sketched up and then built a kind of a portmanteau workbench kit, like you see in these photographs. A box which opened up to become a printing bench, a carving bench, and a stand for the tools and supplies. I thought this was pretty cool, and it did the job very well, traveling with me all the way to LA and Vancouver as well that year, and then back to Japan. Once I was back home, I of course abandoned the kotatsu table completely and began to use this new bench for all my work. But there was a downside to this, in that in order to make that thing portable, I had made it pretty lightweight. A real traditional carver's bench is one of the most solid pieces of furniture you will ever see, able to take all the hammering involved in chopping away the hard cherry wood. Month by month and year, my bench became more and more wobbly and more beaten up. So I kept planning to make a new one, but somehow never got around to it. Yeah, maybe when this print is done, I'll take a week off and make a nice, beautiful new bench. But the next job was always waiting. More than 25 years, a quarter of a century has now passed since that LA trip, and here I am, still using that bench, as you can see in this clip recorded right here in this room just a couple of weeks ago. So now, thank you for your patience. Let's see how these two things that I've talked about, these beautiful Shinhanga prints and my old workbench, are going to come together. It begins with a visit here a couple of weeks ago from a man who lives not too far from here in the well-known old Yanaka district. He had actually been to see our shop a couple of months back and chatted with me lightly at that time, but on this visit now he had more interesting things to tell me. He mentioned that his father had been a craftsman in this field, a carver, and then he added that his name was Harada. I did a mental double take. That Harada? Yes, that one. This man's father had been Mr. Harada Kametaro, the man who worked on any number of these Shinhanga masterpieces. I was actually standing here in my shop chatting with a man who'd been playing running around in the house while some of these very prints were carved. Now this in itself would have been more than enough for me, establishing a personal link to this man. But he then dropped a bomb. His house was kind of small. They were trying to clean up a bit. Might I have any use for an old carver's workbench? You can of course guess my reaction to his suggestion, and a couple of days later, there I was, setting up the bench in my corner of the shop here. It is, as I described earlier, an extremely solid piece of furniture and is such a joy to work on. I'm now kicking myself for waiting so many years before getting such a proper bench, but it seems to have worked out in the end. I have no idea what old Mr. Harada might think of this, his very personal furniture now being used by an outsider like myself. But I rather suspect that he wouldn't mind. After 45 years being stuffed at the back of a closet, to now come back to life, in the hands of a person who can really and truly appreciate its value, this is not such a bad thing, I think. So I think that's it for that video tonight. You know, there's no walk outside this time to close the video. I'm sorry. I'm kind of busy here tonight. Don't worry, we'll resume our normal programming next time. Thank you very much for putting up with this. It perhaps has not been too interesting for you to watch, but it's been something that's very important to me, and I think is going to have a very big effect on my work from now on. Thank you very much, and good night.